Of course, it was a collapse because the state didn't exist anymore. And it's also a collapse of the, if you want to say the Russian part of it. But still, the idea might be a little bit wrong because it sounds as if something was completely destroyed.
From my perspective, as a Russian citizen, I would say that the experience of citizens in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or other major cities, and people from villages, small towns in the Far East are very different. And for sure, it is something very interesting to explore, how people remember and evaluate 90s and today's political regime.
In our first episodes, we met uprisings that opened history from below. East Germany, 1953, Poland, 1980, the Baltic Singing Revolution. Today, we flip the lens. What happened at the Imperial Center when the Soviet system collapsed? I'm Janine Funke, historian and science journalist from Germany, and this is Fighting for Freedom. In this podcast, we explore how societies remember and sometimes forget their past, focusing on uprisings and turning points that challenged Soviet rule. In this episode, we look at the profound transformations of the late 1980s and 1990s, a time of hope and reform, and also of crisis, social decline, and contested memory. The end of the Soviet Union was often framed as a collapse. Yet many structures, networks, and ways of thinking endured, shaping the new Russian state in ways that are still visible today. Understanding this era is key of making sense of Russia's present and its ongoing war against Ukraine. When we speak about the Soviet Union, we are talking about a state that emerged from the ruins of the Russian Empire, the trauma of the First World War and the Revolution of 1917. Founded in 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was, at least in its own narrative, not simply Russia. It was a multinational federation bringing together diverse peoples, languages, and territories under a socialist project that claimed to offer a new egalitarian future. For Russia, this meant both continuity and rupture. On the one hand, the Russian Soviet Republic was a political, cultural, and military core of the new union. Moscow became the center of decision-making. On the other hand, the Soviet experiment also marked a break with Russia's imperial past. Instead of a Tsar, there was now the Communist Party. Instead of private property, there was command economy. And instead of a multi-ethnic empire legalized by dynasty, the USSR justified its existence with ideology, the promise of building socialism and ultimately communism. Yet beneath these ideological claims, many older structures persisted. Centralized power, the dominance of Moscow, and the subordination of peripheral regions, and a culture of authoritarian rule. All of this carried over from the empire into the Soviet form. The Soviet Union was, in many ways, both a new beginning and a continuation of older Russian patterns of governance. Fast forward to 1991, and we arrive at what is often described as the collapse of the Soviet Union. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, 15 independent republics emerged, and the Russian Federation proclaimed itself the successor state. But calling it a collapse risks suggesting a sudden break, a clean slate. In reality, the picture was more complex. Networks of power, social habits, even the cultural imagination of Soviet citizens persisted well into the 1990s and shaped the foundation of the new Russian state. To unpack these dynamics, the blurred line between collapse and continuity, and how culture helped reframe the 1990s, I am joined by two historians. Corinna Kuhr-Korolev from the Leibniz-Centre for Contemporary History in Potsdam, who works on Soviet and post-Soviet public history and museums, and Daria, as well working at the Leibniz-Centre for Contemporary History in Potsdam, researches late Soviet and post-Soviet state comedy and explores how humor actually tracks upheaval from Gorbachev to today. Thanks for joining us.
We are also happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Corinna, as you pointed out in our preparatory talk, it's important to begin with the clarification of terms. Russia and the Soviet Union are often used interchangeably, yet they mean very different things. Could you briefly draw the line between the two and explain why that distinction is so crucial for our discussion today?
It's a problem that people very often mix up Russian and Soviet. So we have always to be clear what we are talking about. If we are talking about the Soviet history, we mean Soviet, and Soviet means the Soviet Union with all its republics, including Estonian, Moldavian, Central Asia, Ukrainian, and so on. And if we are talking about Russian, also in the context of the Soviet Union, we are talking about the Russian Federation, which we also have to be clear that this is also not only Russian-speaking people, it's also people from very many other nations and ethnic groups. And if we are talking about Russia today, it also means the Russian Federation. There's another word for it in Russian. They distinguish between Russian and Rossiyskoye, which Russian is about the Russian-speaking culture or Russian-speaking persons, and Rossiyskoye, Russländisch, можно переводить на немецкий, in German, means everything which is connected to the state of the Russian Federation. So this always makes it difficult if you speak in historical terms about Soviet and Russian history. So are we talking about Soviet as a whole? Are we talking only about Soviet Republic in Soviet times? Are we talking now about Russia? So we always have to be a little bit careful what we are talking about. And sometimes we just can mention that I'm really actually talking about the Russian Federation today, so that things are clear.
Daria, how would you operationalize that distinction in your work between the Soviet context and the later Russian Federation in terms of cultural production and comedy?
In relation of my work, I would say that I'm focusing on Russian Federation geographically with all the infrastructure of cultural production, which of course was strongly, tightly connected with the whole Soviet system of cultural production. But at the same time, I'm focusing on Russian-speaking comedian whose creative activity was connected to theaters, concert venues, concert organization within the Russian Federation. And of course, first of all, Moscow and Leningrad as main spot of culture and all this infrastructure within the whole Russian Federation and the whole Soviet Union. Of course, comedians, the characters of my research came from different Soviet republics, especially Ukrainian Soviet republics was very rich with all these comedians, artists, and in that cases, I'm also always trying to stress the originality or origins of that or another particular character. Yeah. So distinguishing is important, highly important.
Let's move on to another key term, the so-called collapse. Does this word really capture what happened in 1991, or does it risk obscuring how much actually persisted beneath the surface? So let's talk about your view. What disappeared, what remained, and why does that distinction matter?
Yes, in fact, somehow, of course, it was a collapse because the state didn't exist anymore. And it's also a collapse of the, if you want to say the Russian part of it. But still, the idea might be a little bit wrong because it sounds as if something was completely destroyed and something entirely new began. And of course, this wasn't the case. It wasn't a blank state or a free field where something completely new could grow. If you imagine it as a picture, for me it looks more like a ruin. Some of the foundations and walls are still there, others are not, and others are totally missing. So we have to ask ourselves what disappeared and what remained and what is like the meaning of it. And there's also this problem if you think about the end of the Soviet order. It actually collapsed a little bit before 91, because if you think about the important pillars of Soviet order, it was the Communist Party and the Communist Party's monopoly on power, and also the ban on private property. And this was ended even before. So if you look really carefully, you can say that the Soviet order, the basic of Soviet order, was even crashed or ruined or ended already before the official end of the Soviet Union. And then the other question is what remained. If you think carefully, there is a lot, and first and foremost, it's the people who remained, along with their way of thinking, with their way of acting, their values, like the so-called Homo Sovieticus. This is a term which was very popular. This Homo Sovieticus did not simply disappear. And also the networks of people remained. And these networks were very important for ordinary people to survive what was coming next, the difficult 1990s. But these networks were also very important, or are important, for understanding how political and economic power remained afterwards in the same hands. So, for example, it's proven that famous or high rank members of the Komsomol, of the Soviet official youth organization, they became very successful in economic matters after the end of the Soviet Union, because they were able to start or to build up their first savings and their first capital already before the crash of the Soviet Union. So they were the first entrepreneurs in the 1990s.
Two concepts are absolutely central to understanding this transitional era, perestroika and glasnost. Both signaled reform and openness, but they are also terms that have become heavily loaded over time. How would you define them from today's vantage point, and what did they unleash both from above through leadership initiatives and from below through grassroots responses?
I was thinking about that question, and first of all, of course, retrospectively, we define perestroika as the final chapter, a final period in the Soviet history, a time that saw the collapse of the Eastern European socialist regimes and the USSR itself, of course, and contributed to the end of the Cold War. So it's a huge, very broad changes. But at the same time, we have to remember that this period was also significant as a period of intense changes and transformations within all of these societies from above. The reforms introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev, we can say perestroika, can be defined as the course of reforms introduced by the man who happened to be the last general secretary of Communist Party. And, of course, the processes from below, since perestroika gave a huge boost to various social, national, political, and different grassroots movements, actions, and actors. So, while historians today have increasingly turned their attention to the experiences and agency from below, as our project Perestroika from Below does. The dominant narrative in historiography on perestroika still tends to focus on the central Soviet leadership, their decision-making processes, and especially on Gorbachev's action and personality. Even if we take a look on the framework of perestroika, we can see that it spent 1985-91 and determined by the time of Gorbachev leading and being the head of the state. So it's still very concerned with high politics and this general high level of power in Soviet republics, especially in Moscow. To provide just as an example of such perspective on perestroika, I'd like to mention Stephen Kotkin's 2001 book, Armageddon Averted. very interesting research, highly concerned with all these high politics and key figures. And William Taubman's 2017 biography of Mikhail Gorbachev. Also very interesting, detailed research, placing at the very center the figure of Mikhail Gorbachev and his actions, his reforms. So I won't say it was coherent, but it was very multi-aspect reforms in economic sphere, ускорение in Russian, or acceleration, gave a new impulse for economic modernization of the Soviet Union. It was also about significant shifts in the foreign policy and the program of new political thinking, новое политическое мышление, introduced by Gorbachev, as well as democratization, liberalization of social and political life in the USSR, which we know as this umbrella term, гласность, transparency, openness, and all the cultural, political, intellectual shifts glasnost bring to the stage.
Perestroika and glasnost are often told as stories driven from the center in Moscow. But of course, their impact looked very different across the Union. How did these reforms play out differently in the Russian Soviet Republic compared with other republics, say Ukraine or Kazakhstan?
Since the dominant perspective and actual fabric of the social political reality during that time was tightly connected with this decision-making from Moscow, we still cannot just avoid the fact of and the factor and actions of Soviet state leadership and party power. But at the same time, the reaction on these events, these reforms, Gorbachev's action, the processes surrounded perestroika within each of Soviet Republic was unique, in a way, very specific, tightly connected with the context. I mean, if we're talking about Ukraine or we're talking about Kazakhstan, we'll find very different dynamics, which, of course, were connected to the impulses and politics from Moscow.
Yes, as Daria already mentioned, I mean, we have to think about the Soviet Union and within the Soviet Union, the Russian Soviet Republic as a political system which was very much ruled from the center. So the Moscow perspective is important for the political understanding of the functioning of this order. I think it's true to say there would have been any perestroika and no glasnost, like no reforms, no opening up of the society if Gorbachev wasn't willing to start these reforms. So it very much depended on this decision from below. But what happened then was kind of a reaction from below, and I would say it's maybe like ping pong. So there's one impulse from a center and different reactions from different parts of the Soviet Union, also in parts of the Russian Soviet Republic. And then it forced like the center again to react. And so this is like a very dynamic process. And the different republics, as Daria already said, had very much influence on these developments. For example, when the Baltic states were the claim for sovereignty was very strong. This also influenced, for example, same forces in society in Ukraine, like they were looking at what was going on in the Baltic states, and it somehow motivated them to also formulate their ideas about sovereignty. So there's a system of communication within the Soviet Union which very much reacted to each other.
When we speak about the end of the Soviet Union, it's often described as if the system simply collapsed in Moscow. But of course, the reality was far more complex. Could you unpack the internal dynamics that made it impossible for the Soviet system to continue after 1991, politically, economically, and socially? And why is it important not to look at Russia in isolation here, but rather at the interconnected fabric to the entire Union?
If you talk about the end of the Soviet Union or the crash of the Soviet order, you can't take the Russian Socialist Republic on its own, because the Soviet system was very much intertwined, and especially in economics. So there was something produced in one republic, something else in another republic. So this is one part of the problem of the 90s, that the political order did not exist anymore. The economic connections didn't work, and this was one part of the huge economic problem of the 1990s. So if we talk about the end of the Soviet Union or the crash or the erosion of the Soviet Union, we can't talk about Russia alone. So we always have to see this as a complex. And of course, there were very many problems which concerned all parts of the Soviet Union, maybe in different shapes. So there's, of course, economic problems all over the country, poor performance, no innovation, few output, unproductive, and people were missing like products of consumer society, and they compared themselves with the West. Also, like politically, there was somehow everywhere a situation when people felt that nothing is going on. They have no influence. The party was very dominant and very visualized the forms of political communication. So I think this feeling of citizens that they can't change anything. We have this very important book by Yuchak about the end of the last Soviet generation. And I think one point he made is very important, that he said it's more performative actions. Like people were still going to demonstrations or to party meetings, but they took part without taking part. It was just like a performance and without sense. And I think this was a great part of why the Soviet Union crashed. And then, of course, you had these other topics of national identities that in the periphery, in the Soviet republics, like these little nations had the feeling that they were forced upon a certain system which was very much not useful for themselves. So there's a growing sense of oppression and discrimination which was felt, and Glasnost gave the possibility to speak out on all these topics. If you just take one example, Uzbekistan as one of the Central Asian republics, which had a monoculture of cotton production, and there's water surrogation, and there was this feeling that they were forced to produce cotton for the rest of the Soviet Union, also for export, and this really changed their culture and economics, and they were not able to do anything about it. So this is like for Uzbekistan, but you will have similar situations all over the country. Like in Estonia, for example, there was the plan to start a new production on phosphor, which would have been very harmful to ecology of Estonia. So this was, for example, in Estonia, one impulse when people started to organize themselves against this kind of exploitation of their country.
I wanted to add a few words on the Glasnost, if we're talking about this disappointment or the general atmosphere of emptiness of Soviet ideology, or this authoritative, how Yuchak call it, authoritarian discourse, the main ideological voice. Yeah, it became much more weakened with the period of Glasnost, and the way the Soviet authority handled the Chernobyl disaster, I think could be seen as a very interesting and bright example, as proclaimed transparency actually has a very strong limitations. And for Ukrainian Soviet Republic, for Belarus, for parts of Russian Federation, this disaster was huge had a very influential impact, but at the same time, the actions and discursive framing of this disaster was very telling about the system in general and the limitations of glasnost, perestroika, and so on.
As we move into the 1990s, this period is often framed as the re-establishment of the Russian Federation. But as you pointed out, Corinna, there is a lot of conceptual confusion here. Terms like perestroika frequently stretched to cover both the reform era under Gorbachev and the very different transformations under Yeltsin. Could you outline why it is so important to distinguish between these phases and what gaps you see in the research when it comes to understanding the Russian Federation in the 1990s on its own terms?
First of all, I would say that there is some confusion about what people mean. So normally people talk about perestroika, and there's this confusion what they mean when they talk about the perestroika era. And as Daria already mentioned, that the term perestroika really refers to the period of reforms under Gorbachev and was connected with glasnost. And this period ended in 1991. And what started then were the 90s. So now very often people now talk about of perestroika. They mean the entire period of political and social change of the 1980s and the 1990s. So, of course, if you look back, this for many people who are not so much in politics but remember their daily life, this might be really a period which was and of course it is very much close connected. But as historians, we really need to define what exactly we are talking about and what we are investigating. And so what I already said, the processes that took place under Gorbachev, they had a specific framework. And the 1990s, there were consequences of these frameworks. But the developments which occurred in the 1990s are completely happening in a different context. In the 90s, there is no censorship anymore. The political competition was free. It was a very turbulent time of economic privatization and liberalization. This is something new in the 90s, and you don't have to mix it up. And so the forms under Gorbachev were quite limited, and citizens had still some security, but not so much freedom. In the 90s, under Yeltsin, everything was possible. It was really a time of freedom, but also, of course, a time of chaos and social decline. And if people mix these two periods, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, then things are unclear. Then it's very easy to tell a one-sided story. And what we see today is that Putin exploits somehow this not distinguishing, because then it's easy to tell a story only of social decline and of anarchy, and then he can claim himself as the one who is guaranteeing stability and state security and so on. So I think there is some purpose in describing the whole period as a period of social chaos and forgetting about the positive motivations of people in these two periods. And of course, the impulse of freedom. If people now talking about the 90s or about the whole period, they are only talking about social decline, and this idea of freedom is somehow missing. And this is easier to claim if you don't look at these periods as single entities.
We've already hinted at how today's Russian regime instrumentalizes the history. Could you expand on that? How exactly does the Kremlin frame the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and what does it gain by blurring the lines between Gorbachev's reforms and Yeltsin's turbulent 1990s into the undifferentiated narrative of decline and chaos?
It starts with this, that they claim Gorbachev and Yeltsin, they are guilty in destroying the state and in destroying stability. And there is this image of there was a system which was working quietly well, and there were people coming like Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and they purposely destroyed this state. And what I already said, you should look very precisely what you are talking about. Gorbachev, for example, was a person who wanted to have the Soviet Union and also the Communist Party existing. And he was really fighting until his last days for the existence of the state of the Soviet Union. So claiming that he is the one who buried the Soviet Union is just not right. If you look at Yeltsin, his main idea in the beginning was liberalization and freedom and privatization, and his political program was actually really not successful. But he is the one who actually fought against the communist system. So this makes a very huge difference between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They had a very different perspective on the communist idea, of the whole idea of the party as a monopoly of power, and also on economy as a planned economy or a liberal economy in a Western sense. Yes, and as I already said, like for Putin, he tries to show this period, the late 80s and 90s, as a period of social decline and corruption and the lack of stability, the lack of security. And just to tell this very dark story makes it much more easier for him to claim that he's the one who is, again, the garant for stability for each person, each citizen, and the guarantee for a strong state and a strong order of the state. And the claim that if you want stability and security, you need a strong state. And this is the argument for his very repressive politics.
Corinna just outlined how the state narrative reduces this entire period of chaos and decline. But memory is never only shaped from above. It's also lived in people's everyday experiences. Daria, from your perspective, how did ordinary citizens across Russia actually remember and make sense of the late 1980s and 1990s? And do we see differences between those in big cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg and those living in smaller towns or more remote regions?
It's quite hard to talk about people in general. It's always, of course, the question who we're talking about. But to continue Corinna's thoughts on this very simplified picture of cruel, wild 90s and of 80s, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, who corrupted or even betrayed Russian people, and so on. I would say that such type of rhetoric heavily relies on widely spread conspiracy-based ideas, people's resentment, and all these attempts to find any type of explanation. Why did it happen to us? Where our great state gone? And all these understandable, not great, but at least some norms, values, guarantees. I think that Sergei Ushakin's book, Patriotism of Despair, is a very, very interesting insight into that broad discourses, very widely spread among ordinary people, if I may call them that way. And especially interesting that Ushakin made his research inside the field, in his home region of Altai. And it's very, perspective from below, really, voices of people from Russian provincial area. And here I just wanted to add that from my perspective, again, as a Russian citizen, I would say that the experience of citizens in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, or other major cities, and people from villages, small towns in the Far East are very different. And for sure, it is something very interesting to explore. to find the answer to that question, how people estimate, remember, and evaluate 90s and today's political regime and so on.
If we zoom in on culture and memory institutions after 1991, comedians on stage and museums on the ground, what generally changed and what largely persisted? How did the old Soviet infrastructure, founding models and habits of teaching the public carry over into the 1990s? And how did the 2000s reintroduce state steering and censorship?
I was thinking about that continuity and gaps, breaks between late Soviet and post-Soviet Russian cultural sphere. And I would say that, for sure, much more fairly to say that the history of cultural production and imagination in general, cultural imagination, still preserved in a way. I won't say that there are many breaks in topics, characters of jokes, for instance. Of course, since comedians could engage with political agenda and mocked everyday life during 90s, their comedy was tightly connected to today's events. But at the same time, tropes, characters, and main ideas of making jokes publicly remain. Plus, the infrastructure of cultural production, institutions that train in artists, theatrical concert venues with very, very significant part of state funds remain after the collapse of the USSR. Of course, the budget became much more less, but nevertheless. And this distinction between 90s and 2000s are very important, since we see how state interventions and elements of censorship and direct control, once again, as in Soviet period, jump in the picture. So this freedom of 90s, with a very, very close, of course, close connection to the late Soviet atmosphere, but with a broader openness and possibilities, now once again turn out to be the new system of official cultural production, with the censorship, with a very serious role of state foundation, state founding, and the consequences of these state interventions.
Yes, maybe I would like to add from another perspective, from the perspective of museums, because I'm doing research on museums. If you look on the museums, if you have a look at the last 30 years, so there is this period when there were some museums, like museums people really felt the freedom to organize exhibitions who showed something, topics of the Soviet history, for example, Stalinist history, topics of the pre-revolutionary period, which were tabooed. So there is this first time in the late 80s when they are really enjoying this new freedom. And they continue to do so in the 90s. And at the same time, people who are working in the museums, they are still the same. So their way of acting, their way of organizing their work inside the museums is still very similar. The topics are changing, but the way of organizing, for example, exhibitions, the way of talking to the public is not really changing. So there is still this very authoritative way of teaching people in the museum, which was a very Soviet idea. People come to the museum and we have to teach them something. So this kind of perspective is still the same. And then they have in the 90s this huge problem of having not enough budgets. So this social decline or this economic decline has a huge impact on museums. So they were demanding the state giving more money to the museums, and they call the state is responsible for culture, and the state has to support culture. So it's the museums themselves who claim that they need more support of the state. So the state comes in again in the 1990s. And then it comes in very much again, as Daria already told us. So they accept this interference of the state already like 10, 40, 15 years ago. They had the feeling of the state or the government or politicians are giving them orders how to present history, how to present the present. And if we are looking at the picture now, we have this return back to a Soviet-style making of exhibitions, so that in the center they are planning exhibitions on the war in Ukraine, and they are distributing these uniform stories about the war in Ukraine for museums all over Russia to show the same kind of exhibitions everywhere. So this planning from the center a certain exhibition and distributing it as propaganda around the whole country is again very similar to what we had in the 1980s.
Would you say that this brief window of openness in the late 1980s and 1990s was ultimately too short to fundamentally change society? And that while new freedoms existed, only a small part of the population was really able to use them, for example, to reframe Soviet history or to develop more democratic ways of thinking?
No, nothing was sure. And I think, as Daria already mentioned, the parts of society who were able to had the possibility in different terms, in terms of intellectual capability, in terms of money, in terms of having the possibility for exchange with other people. This amount of people was very little. A lot of things were going on, and there were a lot of programs and a lot of intellectual international exchange. But the amount of people who were able to get engaged were maybe 10% of the population. Daria, what do you think?
I was thinking about stand-up comedy. I should say a few words about the context. I mean, during the 90s and early 2000s, the main way of performing stage comedy was very, very conservative, tightly connected with Soviet style of estrada variety performances with, again, the same faces, the same structure of training artists and quite, I would say, closed group of artists and their friends and friends of friends and so on. So it was a group which hardly can be called as transparent and open for new faces, new perspectives, some experiments and so on. But along with internet, all these YouTube and other platforms which gave an opportunity to people with no education, artistic experience, or any type of connections from show business to start their performances, to start their comedic way. And stand-up as the Western form of presenting, performing humor and stage comedy became highly popular and still very popular in Russia. And I was thinking maybe in a way, at least in the realm of comedy, 2010s was, again, very carefully, in a way, continuation of this freedom of 90s, at least the freedom or democratization of possibility to jump in this cultural production. It's fair also, of course, within popular music or hip-hop artists, but since I'm interested in comedy, I was thinking about that new opportunity, which of course was shut down with the beginning of the full-scale invasion and all this wartime censorship in Russia. But I wanted to add that.
And if we look at today, what paths are open for comedians now? Do most of them leave the country, or do they try to keep working underground, or are there still ways to continue performing inside Russia?
I would say that we have, of course, very roughly speaking, three groups of comedians. So first group of the comedians are very tightly connected to the state-sponsored TV channels and other platforms in internet. And they are, of course, very safe comedians. Their jokes, their monologues, sketches are totally ensured with today's legislation and general statements of the regime, I would say. As a bright example, you can find a video of two comedians who are singing comedic song in front of Russian soldiers on the occupied territories of Ukraine. So it's a very, very Soviet style of using culture for propaganda and you name it. Second group of comedians, I would call them indie, independent, who are staying in Russia, trying to find some ways of careful jokes. I won't say it's always successful. We can see a few cases of persecution of comedians. More than tens of Russian comedians are labeled as foreign agents by Russian Ministry of Justice, comedians. And of course, the third group, people who left Russia, who openly condemned the full-scale invasion, and today are trying to find themselves within the European, the American comedy stages, switching the language of their performance into English, or continue to perform in Russian for immigrants all around the world.
You mentioned that the first group of comedians is closely tied to state media. Would you say they function as part of the regime's propaganda machine, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine? And more broadly, if we look back from the 1990s to the longer history of Russian media, can that help us understand how today's audiences actually receive and process these messages?
I won't call it propaganda as such. I mean, the term is also needs to be, situated in the context. But nevertheless, I would say that partially on the level of form, addressing the audience, on the level of choosing topics, very safe, everyday entertainment, almost nothing charged, no political ambiguity. This is very common. This is very familiar. But at the same time, I would say that since audience in Russia has so many sources, despite all the attempts, people still have sources of independent or somehow different perspective. This TV shows, TV comedy is about normalization, is about trivialization of this change in reality. It's not aggressive propaganda as pure propaganda. It's about entertainment, which is also, of course, everything is political, which is also very political, even if apolitical in form. I think this is the difference between the Soviet context and today's Russia. Maybe in a more cynical way of playing with information and different discourses, different perspectives. Like we have so many of points of view, so maybe it's just better to laugh at everything.
Yeah, I think Daria is pointing on a very interesting subject. In Soviet time, of course, people knew much more than they should have known, but still the sphere of public knowledge was much more narrow, and the internet, which might be difficult to understand for people in the West who don't know Russia. The internet, the Russian internet, the RUNet, was very, very political, much more political than it was, for example, in Germany. And still there are these islands of knowledge, of information. And of course, this is a huge difference if you compare it with the Soviet Union. So this makes it difficult for the regime to manage these kinds of informations. And as Daria rightly, I think, addressed, one way is producing fake news, is producing very many sources of information so that people are confused, and they will come back to these kind of informations which they can somehow understand, which seem familiar to them. So this is another kind of managing the media sphere and the information sphere. And of course, yes, it's cynical.
As we bring this discussion to a close, I would like to step back and connect it to the present. Looking at the complexity of this transition period, glasnost and perestroika, the turbulent 1990s, why is it essential to understand these histories in order to make sense of today's politics and ultimately the war in Ukraine?
one very important aspect is that Ukraine decided in the 1990s to take another path. So this development in Ukraine is an alternative to the Russian way of building a new future. And I think that Ukraine made a different choice at that time and still wants to go in a different direction. Makes it somehow dangerous for the Russian establishment. I even would say that maybe one reason why Russia attacked Ukraine was to eliminate this visible example of an alternative development. So only if you understand what happened in the 1990s in Russia and in Ukraine and in other parts of the former Soviet Union, you are able to understand also these motivations in Russia.
I have so many thoughts. So I will jump in my favorite topic, comedy, once again. During the 90s, there was a very popular comedian, Mikhail Zadornov. He was very prominent since the very end of 80s. And I'm sure that his dynamics of his personal perspective and his comedy are a very bright example of the dynamics which can be familiar and actually very telling for the significant part of Russian society. Here I'm talking about this shift from the idea of freedom, new possibilities, new opportunities, which slowly but quite step by step shifts toward the idea of missing of a great power, great glory, past, and all these imaginary attributes of Soviet legacy. I mean, his comedy shows how that topics and stereotypes about neighbors, former Soviet republics, Ukrainians, people from Central Asian republics, Baltic republics, and so on, can be a very funny material, although it's xenophobic, very aggressive, filled with, I would say, hatred, but still very popular, very witty, and prominent among Russians. So, talking about these shifts after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would trace, and I'm trying to trace this dynamic and the way popular genres, popular forms, responds to broader people's emotions, effects, demands, how it engaged, and at the end became a soil for a very successful political manipulation, or what word is better to use for the current regime and its policy. So it's very intersect, it's very overlap from below and above, how it works and intersect.
Thank you very much, Corinna and Daria. It was so interesting talking to you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
What we have seen across these episodes is that freedom in Eastern Europe was never a single breakthrough, but a series of experiments in courage. In episode 1, we showed that the East German workers on June 17, 1953, showed how quickly economic grievance could become a political reckoning, even under tanks. In episode 2, Poland's Solidarność transformed protest into lasting structures, an independent trade union that institutionalized voice. And the Baltic Singing Revolution remind us that culture can be strategy, mass, peaceful, and national without turning violent. Today, we flip the lens on the imperial center. The Soviet Union did not simply vanish in 1991. As Corinna and Daria helped us to see, the 1990s were a tangle of ruptures and routines, new freedoms alongside old networks, museums experimenting while state habits persisted, comedy opening spaces until censorship at war narrowed them again. The ambiguity matters because it's precisely what today's Kremlin exploits. folding Gorbachev and Yeltsin into one story of chaos to sell stability and justify repression. Taking together these histories complicate easy narratives. Uprisings can be crushed and still teach. Culture can mobilize, and collapse can coexist with deep continuities. Next time, we move from the long 1990s into the immediate present. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the trajectories of Russia and Belarus, and how these memories shape the continent today. Join us for the next episode when we continue our journey through history. I'm Janine Funke, and this was Fighting for Freedom. Thanks for listening.